Hey, so this is Ramon, channel is Alpha 4. So here we go with the notes. And it came to pass, at the end of 2 full years, that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. What is this verse talking about? Well, the dreams deal with the idea of the weak overcoming the strong, which is a theme that will be explored in the New Testament more fully. Notice that God talks to those outside of his chosen people and outside of the faith that is dedicated to him alone. He even talks to pagans who make claims to divinity, as Pharaoh is either sometimes considered a god or a son of a god. But the thing is that God talks to who he wants to, regardless of anybody's understanding from outside of the faith or even within the faith. And behold, there came out of the river 7 kine, well favored and fat fleshed, and they fed in the reed grass. Now, I believe in most translations it's 7 cows, sometimes heifers, sometimes cattle. In Egypt's real history, the agriculture truly did depend on the overflow of the Nile. So this is actually, in the story, consistent with actual history. And there will be several things that happen in the story that are consistent with the actual history of Egypt as far as geopolitics are concerned at that time, geopolitics being limited to the Mediterranean. I'm not sure about trade into interior Africa when it comes to Egypt. I know Ethiopia had a strong stranglehold for a while, but I don't know of Egypt itself, how it dealt with the Ethiopian power at that time. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now, these dreams can be a good way to demonstrate how biblical characters themselves interpret what is literal and what is symbolic in the divine message as prophecy or as the Bible itself, as the Bible is divinely inspired. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. A magician dream interpretation manual dating to as early as 1973 BC, that's 1973 years before the birth of Christ, or the Common Era, if that's how you want to word it, has been found, showing that dream interpretation was indeed a task of magicians in Egypt during this time period. As for the wise men, this was usually a known group of royal advisors. Notice, known group of royal advisors in the ancient world, in the royal courts of the ancient world. So this is not saying that they went to every educated man throughout all of what we would now consider modern Egypt, or Egypt at its height, or even throughout the whole world, but that each man that was called in was a recognized advisor with the title wise man. And that's what was coming in. So while it might sound unbelievable that all the wise, educated people or self-taught people in the world showed up to the Pharaoh's doorstep to explain to him what he was dreaming and they couldn't do it. More, what this is saying is that all the employed wise men could not advise the Pharaoh satisfactorily. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. I was restored unto mine office, and he was hanged. And this was verse 13. Here, Joseph's gift would be called, by modern parlance, a charism. The way that this gift would have been understood to have been a gift from God in this narrative is actually the same criteria we use today to judge whether or not prophecy is true. You might say prophecy today? Yes, prophecy today. So what is that? The criteria is set as it is set about in the Bible is this, that all short-term prophecies come true in their time. If the prophecies do not come true in the short term, then you don't believe that that person is a prophet. If they do come true, then you are allowed to believe in their long-term prophecies. It's just that simple. This is a rule of thumb that will be better defined and codified later in Deuteronomy 18, verses 20 through 22. Then let's get to verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. There's an interesting thing here at verse 14, which is the word dungeon. Dungeon also means pit in the Hebrew, which for Christian readers, the word pit denotes hell. So there's an interesting wordplay happening here, a wordplay that would not be present in the original telling of the story, but comes across to a modern audience. Also, note that Joseph shaved himself. No one did that work for him. He was just given the opportunity, and he did not waste it. There's an important lesson there. As God will give you the opportunity, but he won't do the work for you. You have to do it yourself. He'll guide you, he'll help you, but you got to do your part. Then we get to verse 15. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee, that when thou hearest a dream, thou canst interpret it. Mind you, the Old English, in the modern translations, obviously the const and these are taken out and replaced with modern English. But anyway. Absent from many readers' thought when they read this verse, and even when they read all of the Joseph story, at least especially for the first part of it, is that Joseph would have been an immigrant in Egypt. He would have been speaking in a foreign tongue, perhaps a second or third language for him, and he would have been speaking to a native speaker, that is Pharaoh, who would have been well versed in his own language because he resided over the royal court. Now, there are those who will argue that, well, by this point in time, he's been in Egypt for a long time and he's probably as fluent as a native speaker. But believe me, I live in a border town. I have spoken to people who have been around English their whole lives, and yet they either don't have a very full vocabulary, or they are still, though they can understand, they cannot actually speak the English language. Now let's get to verse 33. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out, a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Then we go to verse 37, and I know it seems like I'm not including the note, but these two verses tie in together. They cover a lot of ground. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants. Here, verses 33 through 37, deal with Joseph's unsolicited recommendations to Pharaoh and the king's enthusiastic response. Unknown to Joseph, by helping Egypt survive the upcoming disaster, he is enabling the rift between his brothers and he to heal in the future. Then we get to verse 40. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word, all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. Here it is very clearly stated that Joseph's power doesn't come from him. And in the story, in the narrative, we see that his power actually comes from God and then from Pharaoh. But that power lays or is exercised in a way that benefits the less fortunate, making Joseph the king in function, though not in title. He was, although that might seem controversial to someone looking at it from a historical perspective, it is not. For he was a king in the way that the Hebrew audience who was hearing this story at that time would have understood the role of a king to be. But he was not a king or a pharaoh in the way the ancient Egyptians would have understood that role. Nor was he the king in a way that a modern reader would understand that position. If you want to think about King Arthur. Okay? King Arthur is a revolution on what kings are supposed to be. Here we have a revolution on what a king is supposed to be. Is the king supposed to be Pharaoh, or is a king supposed to be Joseph? It's a great revolution in thought. It's teaching a lesson without pounding you over the head with it, like I am right now, explaining it. Then we get to verse 42. And Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. Interestingly, in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, verses 9 through 18, it interprets the position that Joseph was appointed to as governor or overseer. And the giving of the ring was not uncommon nor unprecedented, as it was simply a seal or signet ring, which, much like the cylinder seals, which we have already seen in the Old Testament as a name seal, was given to officials in royal service, so as to say that they spoke for or with the authority of the king. This was actually a regular practice in Lower Egypt, and it is a custom dating back millennia, as was the giving of a gold chain. Gold was a symbol of royalty. Yet for all that, it is important to say that Joseph's authority was one of function, not title. So he was viceroy in a sense. I don't think if you go through the ancient historical record, you're going to find Joseph's Egyptian name tied to a viceroy in the sense that we understand it, though we might find it tied to a governor of grain, a governor or overseer of grain distribution. We may find that name one day. Then we get to verse 44. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee no man shall lift up a hand or his foot, I just picked up my foot, in all the land of Egypt. So what does that mean? Picking up your foot, lifting up a hand. What does that mean? That if Pharaoh is strong, but it's Joseph who they need to lift up a hand or foot? Let's go to verse 45. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphaneth Penach, and he gave him to wife Asneth, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Again, Joseph being renamed Zeneth Paneth, he who explains what is hidden, is an expected and well-defined, well-precedented custom of almost all kings of this time period. It was the custom and tradition of kings of this time period to rename a servant or subject appointed to eminence, as God renames those whom he brings to eminence throughout Genesis. Asneth, the wife, her name also has meaning. Her name means the one who belongs to the goddess Neith. Okay, so the Egyptian goddess Neith was the goddess of war and hunting, and she was mentioned by Herodias, but misidentified with Athena by him. Interestingly, in Judaism, the marriage of Joseph, a Hebrew, to Asneth, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, and remember On is Heliopolis. Remember, she's a Gentile. And that type of marriage was not yet recognized in Israeli, or I guess at this point in history we should say in Abrahamic practices. How do you mesh that kind of marriage? Well, because in Egypt you could have this kind of marriage. And he was in Egypt, and he was living as an Egyptian. Joseph, that is, was living as an Egyptian. Yet, to fix this, An extra biblical story during the Hellenistic period titled Joseph and Asneth has her convert to Judaism. Now, though this was purely anachronistic, as the rites of conversion did not exist yet during any period this story could have realistically been dated at historically, it is still a way for the Hebrews, for the Jews, to deal with this problem of Joseph marrying a Gentile. Then there is her father, Potiphar. His name means whom Ra gave. Obviously, we all know who Ra is. And Heliopolis, where he lived, where he was from. And it stood as that main temple as far back, at least as far back as 2345 BC. 2345 BC. Think about that. So this story, now, if we're talking about just pure possibilities, we can now stretch back this story as far back as 2345 BC, and the story's still possible. Maybe not probable, but it's definitely still possible. Then we get to verse 50. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came, whom Asneth, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore unto him. Joseph being allowed to marry Asneth is supposed to be seen by the reader as vindicating Joseph from the accusations he had already served 12 years for, as well as a signal proving his innocence to the rest of the Egyptian world within the narrative. Also, as an aristocrat and a native Egyptian daughter, Asneth, who married a foreigner, ex-slave, who was also a freed prisoner, Asneth, not Joseph, would have had the power and authority of the household in this relationship, as far as the Egyptians were concerned during this period of Egyptian history. Which again is another inversion. You have a younger son being lifted up. You have a Hebrew marrying a non-Hebrew. You have a whole lot of stuff happening here that later on would not be allowed. And you have one more right here, which is where the woman would have more authority over the man. So there's a lot going on in this story. In all honesty, this story works on its own as a novella. And if you can find that other story, which I don't know if it's still around, you can find the Joseph and Asneth story. You put that together with this story. I mean, you have yourself an ancient epic. You really do, or at least a saga. All right, then we get to verses 51 through 52. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn male Manasseh. For God hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim. For God hath made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. While Joseph now tries to repress his family history, it will reemerge in the next chapter. Joseph's story in this chapter parallels Daniel's story, which could indicate several things. 1, that Daniel draws from Joseph. 2, that Joseph's tale draws from Daniel's, but not necessarily, because coincidences do happen. Just look at Lincoln and JFK. It is possible that this is just a thing that happens. Or it could mean that the stories were written either near each other or influenced each other, one way or the other. For those who are literalists, they would hope that Joseph's story influences Daniel's story, but the Daniel story has more verifiable history, so it's possible it could go the other way. But the Joseph story is completely possible and consistent with other stories from Egypt of that time period, of the time period this story is supposed to have taken place. Let's continue on with verse 54. And the 7 years of famine began to come, according as Joseph had said. And there was famine in all lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. Acts chapter 7, verse 11, gives the lands affected by the famine as Egypt proper in Canaan. So while it says all the lands here, in the New Testament, the apostles viewed these lands, all the lands, as meaning Egypt proper and the land of Canaan, not the entire world, just to be clear, for those who are worried about credibility. And then we get to verse 57. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy corn, because the famine was sore in all the earth. The expression, all the earth, is an exaggeration that simply means all the surrounding land, or all the places relevant to the event. Again, this situation of Egypt being the breadbasket, and it's just like the flood story. The whole world was flooded. Remember when I talked about that earlier? If even in modern times, when a city floods, if you're on top of your house and you're looking out, to you from your perspective, the whole world has flooded. These are expressions that express what the character is feeling, is seeing, what the narrative is trying to explain, what you as the reader should be seeing in your mind when you are experiencing this story. You should see the whole world, as far as you can see, is flooded. Here, you should see the whole world, as far as you can see, is in famine. Do you see? Again, this situation of Egypt being the breadbasket for the rest of the Mediterranean world during times of famine was neither unprecedented nor unheard of. For much of ancient history, in times of agrarian hardship, this was absolutely true. It was Egypt that supplied the rest of the Mediterranean world with food when the rest of the world was going hungry. Now, I have some questions. Question number 1. Why was Pharaoh so easily persuaded as to Joseph's words, given how far away the events that was being prophesied were? Anyone who wants to answer that, feel free. Obviously, I'm going to say it's because God inspired Pharaoh to believe Joseph's word, but maybe you have a different answer. Question number 2. Do you like the Midrash explanations? Or like me, do you find them too tame? Remember, the Midrash explanation for the detail that was missing in this narrative was that the baker put a rock inside the bread and that the cupbearer put a fly. It was that the cupbearer put a fly in the goblet and that the baker put a rock in the bread of Pharaoh. Are the midrashes satisfying to you? Or, like many of the early Christians, did you just feel it was added material that didn't need to be included with the rest of biblical history, as those are not considered inspired writings, and Christians do not look to them for answers? Peace, like, and subscribe. I'll talk to you all later. I love you all. Have a great night. If you believe in God, give thanks to God.